we're now going to turn to the two participants and ask them to respond to each other's comments somewhat briefly so we can eventually hear from the audience. Steve?
Yes. Thanks, Liz, for a very stimulating and apposite presentation. I have a number of comments. One of them is that I don't dispute a lot of the points that you made, but many of them have lost sight of the datum that we're here to explain in the first place. Basic abilities like knowing that an object is still there when you put a hanky over it, or knowing that one object won't pass through another, are not the kinds of things that distinguish someone who's going to be a physics professor at math from someone who isn't. And a number of the cases in which you correctly said that there's no gender difference in kids, there isn't a gender difference in adults either, such as the give a number task and other basic core abilities. Also, one big concern with all of the null effects that you mentioned is the question of statistical power. And Bob Rosenthal, 20 years ago, pointed out that the vast majority of studies that psychologists do are incapable of detecting the kinds of results that they seek, which is why it's so important to have meta-analyses and large sample sizes. Would like to question whether all of the null results that you mentioned can really be justified in terms of being even comparable to the studies done on older kids and adults. One place where I really do disagree with you is about the value of the SAT-M, where the circle, I think, has amply been broken. This is what the people at the College Board are obsessed with. And what they have shown is, regardless of the what you are treating as the gold standard, namely performance in college courses, what the datum is that we're disputing is not how well boys and girls do in school or how well men and women do in college, because there we agree that there's no male advantage. On the other hand, for the thing that we really are discussing, namely performance at the upper levels, getting tenure-track jobs, getting patents, and so on, the analyses have shown that the SAT is not biased against girls, namely a given increment in your SAT score predicts a given increment in the important variable to the same extent whether you're male or female. And it's moreover not true that I think there's a slight difference in the finding that both of us were alluding to. In terms of the difference in grades, it's not that girls' grades come about, better grades come about because they take easier courses. They don't. They really do get better grades holding courses constant. Rather, it's that the underprediction of the SAT can be explained by the combination of conscientiousness and
so the most
choice.
recent thing I've read about this that contradicts that. It's the Gallagher and Kaufman book, Sex Differences in Mathematics, which just came out about a month ago. The numbers that they report is that equating for classes and institutions and looking just at A students, there's a 21-point SAT math differential. That is to say, for two students getting the same grade of A, the average for the girls, the SAT will have been 21 points lower. And that differential is there at every grade level, and it's there in all the courses. And the SAT, people have discussed it as a problem. One of the discussions reached the conclusion that the SAT was still useful because although it was under-predicting girls' performance in college, girls' grades was over-predicting their performance in college. And if you used the two together, you would be okay. And in fact, they ended up advising that people never take account of the SAT simply by itself. Consider it in relation to kids' grades, which I think, as you were talking earlier about with GREs and us admitting people to grad school, that's in fact what colleges do and what graduate programs do. Interestingly, though, in all of the public discussion of the relative advantages or disadvantages of men versus women for math and science that's taken place over the last 2 months, people have not used the SAT in conjunction with grades to talk about relative ability. They've used the SAT by itself, and I think that's led to a really distorted conversation here about this issue.
Okay, but it nonetheless remains the fact that there remains true that in the most recent study by Lubinsky and Benbow, looking at the fantastic predictive power of giving an SAT even in 7th grade, there was no difference in predictive power of in boys and girls in any of these measures. But let me turn to another one.
Go ahead.
Bill, again, going back to the datum that is at issue here, which is the differential representation of the sexes in physical sciences, mechanical engineering, and mathematics. The fact that men and women are equal overall in spatial abilities and in mathematical abilities is a little bit irrelevant to this. So it may be that the particular talents in which women excel make them more likely to go into accounting. But again, the datum is not a gender difference in accounting. The datum is a gender difference in the physical sciences, engineering, and mathematics. And I think if you look at the range of professions, the size of the sex discrepancy is predicted by how much spatial cognition and how much abstract mathematical reasoning each of those jobs requires. In terms of the effects of parents' expectations, I think there was a sense starting in the 1970s that the model for development is that as the twig is bent, so grows the branch. That very subtle differences in parents' perceptions early in life can have a lasting effect. You aim the child in a particular direction and you'll see the effect years later. I think now there's an enormous amount of research spearheaded by the behavioral genetics revolution that is not true, that there are effects of parenting, parental expectations, parental treatment on young children when they're in the home, and that in every study, short of outright abuse or neglect, those effects peter out. The studies of adoption and twins and sibs reared apart show that those differences the differences that occur in parenting are a function of pre-existing differences in the children. Any additional effect of parenting peters out to nothing.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I think that one thing that's different about the gender case than about the early socialization case for other kinds of qualities, different styles of parenting and so forth, is that the differences that we see reflected in parents' differing perceptions are mirrored in differing perceptions that males and females experience throughout their lives. It's not the case that you would just look at one idiosyncratic pair of parents who were treating kids in one way, but then as soon as they left that environment, other people are going to be treating them differently. Rather, I think what we have in the case of gender is such a pervasive pattern that, I'm rather a nativist about cognition, and I would be tempted to look at that pattern and think, maybe Darwin gave us some bizarrely, innately wrong idea about the genders that just keeps getting perpetuated in different people as they're looking at them. I think that when we see that professionals in professional contexts are showing the same patterns of evaluation that parents are showing in home contexts. And when we think that children are going to be facing those patterns of evaluation, not just when they're young and at home, but continuing through high school and into college and finally with their colleagues on academic faculties, that we're dealing with a very much more pervasive kind of effect than the effects of socialization that other studies that you've written about and talked about are dealing with.
Mm-hmm. About bias, I don't, as I mentioned at the outset, I don't doubt that bias exists, although the idea that the bias started out by some arbitrary coin flip one way or another, and that they've only been perpetuated by the existence of bias, I think is one that's extremely unlikely. Both because in so many cases, as Eagly and the stereotype accuracy people point out, the biases are accurate, and also because, there's an irony in these discussion of people's biases, that when we test people in the cognitive psychology lab and we don't call these base rates gender, we applaud people when they apply them. If they apply the statistics of groups to an individual case, that's called accurate Bayesian reasoning, overcoming base rate neglect. Now, when people do it in the case of gender, we treat it as a cognitive flaw. Now, I think it is a moral flaw. Namely, I don't think that base rates ought to be applied in judging individuals, but the fact that they're applied does not mean that their origin was completely arbitrary. Indeed, their origin may be statistically sound in many cases.
Can I reply to that? Because I agree that the origin is not arbitrary, and I agree that there's a bias there for an objective reason, but I think you're drawing the wrong conclusion about it. I think the reason there's a bias to think that men have greater natural talent for math and for science is that when we look around the world and we ask, who's winning the Nobel Prizes, who's making the great advances in science, what we see again and again and again is men. This year, for the first time, Linda Buck in physiology or medicine. But for the most part, it's overwhelmingly men who are achieving at the upper levels of math and science. And I think it's very natural to look at that and think there must be some reason, some inner difference between men and women, which is producing this enormous disparity. And I quite agree with you that good statistical reasoning would then lead you to think, okay, the next kid who comes along, if they're a man, they're more likely to join that group of Nobel Prize winners too. What I would like to suggest is that we have good reasons to resist this kind of conclusion. And the reasons aren't only moral, they're also logical. And let me just use an analogy, okay? Let's replay this debate over the biological bases of mathematics and science talent 150 years ago. Let's consider who the 19th century mathematicians and scientists were, okay? What we will find is that they were overwhelmingly male, just as they are today. But we'll also find that they were overwhelmingly European. You're not going to see an Asian face, you're not going to a Chinese face, you're not going to see an Indian face. It would be very tempting to apply the same pattern of statistical reasoning and say, there must be something about European genes that give greater mathematical talent than Asian genes do, okay? And if we go back still further and we play this debate back in the Renaissance, I think we should conclude that Catholic genes make for better science than Jewish genes, okay? Because all those Renaissance scientists, they were all Catholic, okay? I think if you look at those cases, you see what's wrong with this argument. What's wrong with the argument is not that biology is irrelevant. I don't think that if Galileo had been switched as a baby at birth with some other baby in Pisa from the ghetto and raised by Galileo's parents, that baby from the ghetto would have ended up teaching us that the language of physics is mathematics, okay? I think Galileo's genes had something to do with this. But so did Galileo's cultural, social environment, and his nurturing. Genius requires huge amounts of both. And my bet is that if in that baby switch, Galileo had found himself growing up in the Pisan ghetto, he wouldn't have ended up being an example in this discussion today either. So yes, there are reasons for this statistical bias, but I think we want to step back for them and ask, why is it that all those Nobel Prize winners are men today? And consider the possibility that the answer to that question is the same reason why all the great scientists in Florence were Christian.
Yes, I think you could take the same phenomenon and make exactly the opposite argument, which is that if the phenomenon were really that there is a self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating dynamic to the fact that a difference originates perhaps for arbitrary reasons, people perceive the difference, they perpetuate it by their expectations, combined with the fact that, as you say, people don't go into fields in which the representation is not like their own group, then the dynamic that you'd expect is that the representation of different genders or ethnic groups should go to the extremes. Namely, you have a positive feedback loop where if you're in a minority, it will discourage people from entering the field, which will mean that there'll be even fewer, and on either side of a barrier, you should get a diffusion in opposite directions. The opposite model, I don't know if there are hard data that would verify it, but I suspect that the opposite model applies, namely that there certainly have been in many points in history arbitrary barriers against the entry of genders and races and ethnic groups to various professions. In many cases, as soon as the barrier is removed, far from the statistical underrepresentation perpetuating itself, as you predict, you get the floodgates opening and people reach some natural level. The Jackie Robinson effect in baseball. In the case of gender and science, remember what our datum is. It's not that women are underrepresented in professions or in sciences. In many professions, they are are perfectly well represented. For example, being a veterinarian, majority women by a long shot. If you go back 50 or 100 years, there were no veterinarians who were women. That did not perpetuate itself via this positive feedback loop that you've alluded to.
I think I'm glad you brought up the case of the basketball and baseball players. I think it's interesting to ask, what distinguishes the cases where you remove the overt discrimination and within a very short period of time, the differential disappears, from the cases where you remove the overt discrimination and the covert discrimination continues and it doesn't disappear? What seems to me to be the case in the athletics kinds of cases where you see discrimination disappearing quickly is that there are clear, objective measures of success. Whatever you think about the capacities of a black player, if they are hitting the ball out of the park, they are going to get credit for a home run, okay? That is not the case in science. In science, the judgments are subjective every step of the way. Who's the really talented person? Who deserves the bigger lab space? Who should get the next fellowship? Who should get promoted to tenure? These are not based on clear objective criteria. These are the cases where I think you see discrimination persisting. You see it in academia, you see it in Claudia Golden's studies of the orchestra auditions where subtle judgments, who's the more emotive, sensitive player? If you know that they're male or female, you're going to be picking only men, but if they're behind a screen, you'll start picking more women. I think in these cases, you don't see things dropping away.
Break in here. I'm going to give you each 1 more minute to wrap up,
Okay.
And then we're going to go to the audience. So 1 minute each.
I'm not going to. I just want to respond to that. I don't think I'm going to wrap up everything else I said. But I think that makes the wrong prediction. The harder the science, the greater the participation of women. It's exactly the opposite. It's the most subjective fields, the social sciences, the humanities within academia, that have the greatest representation of women, which indeed follows exactly what the choices that women express in terms of what gives them satisfaction in life, but goes in exact opposite to the prediction you made about the role of objective criteria. Surely it's physics compared to, say, sociology that has the more standard objective criteria for success.
Liz?
Well,
1 minute, or are you ready for the audience?
Well, let me just say one thing, because I didn't say much in the talk at all, about this issue of motives and there being biological differences in motives. Because I do think that that's been a less controversial one, but I think it's an important one, and most of your examples were concerned with that. I think it's a really interesting possibility that the forces that were active in our evolutionary past have led men and women to evolve somewhat differing concerns. I think that that's a real possibility. But I think that to jump from that possibility into the present and draw conclusions about what people's motives will be for pursuing one or another career is way too big a stretch. As we both agree, the kinds of careers that people are facing now, the kinds of choices they're making are between options radically different from anything that anybody faced back in the Pleistocene. And it is anything but clear how motives that evolved then would be translated into a modern context. If I can just give one example of this, you've suggested as a hypothesis that because of sexual selection and also parental investment issues, that men will be selected to be more competitive and that women will be selected to be more nurturant. Well, if we want to translate from that to make predictions about desires for careers in math and science, we're going to have to answer a question that I think is really wide open right now. Suppose that that were true. What makes for better motives for a scientist? What kind of motives are more going to propel you to become a good scientist? Competitive motives, like the motives that J.D. Watson described in the double helix, out to get the structure of DNA before Linus Pauling does? Or nurturant motives of the kind that Doug Melton has been describing recently and talking about why he's going into stem cell research to find a cure for juvenile diabetes, which his children are suffering from. I think it's anything but clear how motives from our past are going to translate into modern contexts. And we would need to do these experiments of getting rid of discrimination and social pressures in order to find out.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask again that the questions be made very briefly. And we have some microphones to make sure people can be heard. Hands high so I can see you. Down here in the red shirt.
Can you hear it?
I just had a quick question. How can you take achievement tests or, for example, the ability of men and women to learn a science and compare it to the ability of men and women to create science? Because after all, professors aren't good at learning what other people have done. They're good at doing stuff that people have never done.
That's a fair point. I think that's a criticism both of using basically any of the indicators that we see among students, either performance at, ability to learn new scientific material that's new for that student, though not new in the history of science, or the ability to give very rapid responses on short standardized tests. I think that's a criticism of both. I mean, my own view is that the ability to learn new material in school is still closer to what a scientist does. But I take your point that real science is going beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, Lubinsky in a recent paper notes that the SAT administered at age 12 predicts what the mean number of patents that you've received, as well as having been enrolled in graduate school for 3 years. So it suggests, I mean, granted, very few people get patents, but that's certainly one kind of objective measure of creativity in these professions.
Hi. About the subjectivity issue that just came up. The issue is not the subjectivity of the scientist towards their work. The issue is the subjectivity of the perceiver. So as long as the people are fine with allowing women to excel or to be credible in the humanities or social sciences, which, by the way, I'm an artist by profession, and that's not even true all the way there, then there is no contradiction between what Professor Stock has said and the fact that there are more women in more subjectively perceived fields. I have a couple of comments about movement.
We're looking for a brief question.
Yeah, but this is really important because the spatial stuff does have to do with science and arts, and it's also true that women are often limited by social mores in feeling permitted to move around or express their sexuality freely. And I think all these might also inhibit them from feeling confident in the abstract thinking. Thank you.
Okay. Next question, over here. And then...
I'm struck that no one has raised another question of what seems to me to be obvious unintentional discrimination, which is that when you have a field that has been dominated by men for the last 100, 200, forever, mathematics and science, that the defining of what makes you successful in that field will be designed to match male phenotype. So, for example, we all know that if you want to take off time to have a baby, you can't be a serious scientist or a mathematician. If you're not willing to put in 80 hours a week, you can't be a serious scientist or mathematician. But might that not, in fact, be something that's only true because a male-dominated academia has defined the rules that way, that it might turn out, if we allowed it to happen, we give men sabbaticals, give them a year off so that they can enrich and grow and become better scientists. But if a woman takes a year off to have a baby, that impairs her growth as a scientist. So the question very simply is, doesn't it make sense that there almost necessarily has to be a built-in bias about motivation, because what motivates men to go into a field becomes the defining feature of what makes you successful in it?
I agree with part of that, and I think there are certain features of both the actual structure of academia that were set up when men laid out the rules. Certainly the upper out and tenure policy is a glaring example. The ubiquity in hard sciences of weekend retreats and evening seminars is a second. The fact that in a number of fields, I think there's a certain fetishization of mathematical modeling, even when it's utterly sterile. I mean, I think in psychology, there's been an awful lot of mathematical psychology and probably some bias towards the people who tend to do it simply because it's men doing the judging. On the other hand, I think that only goes so far. I think it's just necessarily going to be true that anyone of either sex who works 80 hours is going to accomplish more than someone who works 40 hours. I think someone who takes a year off is not going to accomplish the same as someone who doesn't take a year off. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't put in mechanisms designed to redress these facts so that we don't do without the enormous talent of women scientists that is compromised by the fact that for the foreseeable future, women will have a greater role in child rearing. But I don't think that all of it is arbitrary, though I agree that some of it is self-serving mechanisms, that is.
I think there's two issues here that ought to be separated. One that you called attention to is an issue of timing of the lifetime career trajectory. If there's going to be one concentrated period of time when work is highest, has that been chosen at a time that's equally advantageous for men and women? And there it seems to me the answer is a clear no. But there's a second issue, which is there a difference between the sexes such that men are inherently more passionate about their work and want to do it longer, for longer hours than women do? I actually think that question is wide up in the air. I don't think we can know. My personal guess is that there's no such difference. Certainly if you look at UN statistics, something like 66 to 80% of the work of the world is done by women, not by men. If we look at average performance, it doesn't look as if it's the men who are really eager to go out and work all around the clock and the women who are taking time off and sitting on the beach. So that's one thing. But another, I think that actually, maybe that's enough. I think that we would need most of the men who were working in academia. This idea that men are working 80 hours a week around the clock, I think, is also not true. There'll be intense periods of time before tenure. There'll be intense periods of time before grants. There's also a lot of time going to conferences and out to lunch and other things that go on. I think that the stereotype of the male working around the clock and the woman taking care of her babies is probably rather exaggerated.
Okay, here.
This was really interesting, and I just have a comment rather than a question. It seems that the snapshot of a situation as it is today, it's very important, of course. But however, it seemed to me that, like, if you just look a few centuries ago, women would burn as witches. For millions of women would just burn if they would express their opinion, or needless to say, probably they wouldn't study math. So this historical view gives us I think maybe a better explanation of that it does take time for everyone to get better and to advance. And with this advancement in medicine today, as we have longer lives, I think there is still a chance for women and for all of us to not only have our kids but also have our career. And so I think it's time to be optimistic about that.
Thank you. Over here.
So, brief question. Both President Summers and Professor Spelke mentioned that social factors as being very important in these discrepancies, and it didn't figure prominently in Professor Pinker's description. I wanted to ask him whether the checklist that she put up at the beginning, which had a very small check next to social and a very big check next to some of the innate and motivational issues, is the way you see it, because both of you talked about some potential differences. Whether those differences make a big difference or not, I guess, seems to be the debate. I wanted to get your perspective on whether you see, not whether there are any differences exist or don't exist, but whether or not they really account for a significant share of what's going on in terms of the underrepresentation of women in science, math, and engineering.
Well, I would want to do that, multiple regression in my head. I think it is doable. I think that the fact that some of these differences are quite enormous, a standard deviation or more, is going to mean that in both interests, certain abilities, although I think interests are far more important than abilities, suggests it's very unlikely that all of it will be due to discrimination, especially since, again, getting back to the datum that we're trying to account for. I would say a significant proportion to all four. It would be my best guess. I mean, the best way I could do the regression in my head, but I think you'd really need better analysis to settle that.
Okay, last three questions. First here.
On the question of hours worked, I wanted to ask Professor Pinker why he would assume, as he apparently does, that 80 hours of work is equivalently good, is the equivalent of 2 times 40 hours of work. Or why the assumption might be that productivity in terms of numbers of papers is the same simply as an additive effect. When I worked as an editor at a leading peer-reviewed journal in a scientific field, the editors were often on the watch for what they called salami publication, which was the tendency among very prolific, extremely ambitious researchers to slice their work as narrowly as they could, so as to publish as much of it as possible and thus extend the size of their CVs. It probably was very effective in gaining them certain rewards in their professions, but whether that is the same as scientific creativity and real long-term productiveness is open to doubt.
Well, there are two issues here. One of them is salami publication, and indeed there are data that men engage in that more often than women do, and that is something that ought to be taken into account in tenure evaluations and such. But in terms of number of hours put in, it's just got to be the case that all things being equal, if you work 80 hours, you're going to do more than 40 hours. Not necessarily twice as much, but that's just a law of arithmetic. Unless the output is 0 for a lot of those for all of those extra hours, or unless there's perfect compensation so that everyone who does less work is exactly more productive in terms of output per unit time. It's just the law of arithmetic.
Okay.
This question is for Dr. Spelke, and it brings us back to the issue that started the whole debate, which is why aren't there more women in science at Harvard? And it's motivated by the very striking data you report about discrimination on the basis of CVs, which shows clearly there is discrimination. However, the effect does not hold for the most stellar CVs, and I presume that Harvard is getting those in the sciences. So can you tell us what you think is going on?
Yes. I think that the finding that it didn't hold for the most stellar CVs was that when you send out, the subjects in this study came from a range of different universities. They weren't all at Harvard. So the most stellar CVs would have been off scale by the standards of most of the universities that the people who were in the study were in, okay? What I think the conclusion is the following, and I think it holds at Harvard as well as anywhere else, although I say this with the qualification that the data I gave you don't directly say this, but I think this is probably what's going on, that overt discrimination has really declined. When we see someone who is clearly a star, we're going to go for them, whether they're male or female. But no matter where you are, most decisions are not that easy. Most decisions, there's going to be multiple candidates, and we're not quite sure who the best one is, and we can see pros and cons in all different directions. And I think what these studies are telling us is that it's in those difficult cases that perceptions get colored in a way that leads us to overvalue the accomplishments of men and undervalue the accomplishments of women. And my guess is that that's occurring at institutions like Harvard every bit as much as it is in other places.
There is an interesting prediction there, and I don't know what the data are, but if the role of the priors or base rate or bias diminishes as the quality improves, you would expect there to be a greater gender imbalance in the lower quality institutions and less of one in the higher quality. And I don't know what the data are, but
well, no, I mean that's assuming that the relevant variable is quality as opposed to difficulty of decision, right? I mean, I think that if there's no overt discrimination, then easy decisions are going to be easy, and you're not going to see an effect of gender labeling on those decisions at any level. Right, it's going to be the hard ones where you're right on the edge where you'll see the difference.
But to the extent that the gender discrepancy comes from that labeling phenomenon, one would expect to see less gender discrimination when, and hence fewer gender disparities when all the CVs are at the top end compared to when most of them are in the middle.
Well, okay, so that's a
That's a
technical
prediction.
question. That's a prediction.
So
Okay.
there should be, yeah.
Last question.
This question is for Dr. Pinker. If I understood correctly, you do believe there is some degree, you acknowledge there is some bias. I wonder if you have formed an opinion about how that would be best mitigated.
Well, certainly making people aware of the possibility of bias would be important. In terms of overt attempts to measure it and nullify it via, say, aggressive affirmative action, I think all I'm going to say is I think there are costs and there are benefits, and that's something that I don't feel qualified to opine on in this format.
Let me thank all of you for joining us today, but in particular, let's thank the speakers who gave remarkable presentations.